There are all kinds of methods for reading and studying the Bible. I don't know that any one method is better than any other. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages. I can tell you, though, the thing that has made the most impression on me studying the Bible is something Wanda and I started doing several years ago. I talked a little about it last week. We decided to start reading a chapter or two aloud from the Bible each evening. We initially started doing this with just the intent of reading the Gospels. Wanda and I had both discussed about how we were in church all of our lives, but we felt like we heard the same few verses over and over again. You probably have, you go to church all of your life and you hear the same few verses over and over. So we wanted to get a good overview with the Gospels, just what Jesus said, not what somebody else says, but what Jesus said. So we started with Matthew, and we do a chapter or two every night. And when we got through with that, we started back again. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, start back again. And we did that for ages. I guess it was over a year. So we were very familiar with that. Then we went to other parts of the New Testament. We read through those again. Then went back to the Gospels, read that. We read the rest of the New Testament. We did that on and on and on. And we were struck by something as we did that. First, we spent months and months and months, maybe even a year, reading nothing but the Gospel. Then we started reading other things from the New Testament, and the differences were startling. They really were. Then we decided we'd start in the Old Testament. Now, the first part of Genesis wasn't too bad. But after we started moving on after the first, say, 10 to 12 chapters in Genesis, especially as we got on into Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, it was like a completely different thing. It was like a completely different world, a completely different religion. Now keep in mind that probably for 2 years or more we had read only the New Testament. And here we were in the Old, and the differences were striking. They really were. Most of the time in our Bible study, and this is how devotional guides have it put out, and if you're one of those programs where you read the Bible every day, they might have a passage from the Old Testament, then they might have a Psalm, then they might have a New Testament. And so usually in our Bible study, we look at little parts cut out. Or maybe we just look at one passage a day. We look at little parts cut out, we skip all over the place. When you look at all of it, though, and go straight through without cutting things out, it makes a different impression, especially if you get used to this and then go over here and think, this is a different Bible. Now, in my life, I've studied the Bible a lot, but I had never done it that way, reading aloud, concentrating on one section for a long period of time, and then going to some others. It made me realize something that I guess I knew. I didn't know this, but I had never let it sink in because I never really had it illustrated to me so graphically. The Bible is not one continuous narrative. It is individual, separate chunks. And that becomes apparent when you study it the way we did. There is a disconnect between the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. There's a disconnect between some of the Gospels themselves. And there's sort of a disconnect between some of the other writings of the New Testament themselves. If you read the book of James, it seems like what James is saying, don't listen to Paul, he's not telling you the truth. So, in other words, the separateness of the writings is really obvious when you read them the way we did. But the main thing that struck us was the huge disconnect between the New Testament and the Old, and I mean huge. Now, usually each evening when we finish our reading, we talk about something in that reading. And after getting into the Old Testament, all we could say was, this is talking about something else. And that really made an impression on me. And I thought about it, and I thought about the disconnects that we saw between the Gospels and the New Testament, and the huge disconnect we saw between the New Testament and the Old. And I thought about why that was true. And that's what I'd like to develop the thought of today. One of the big disconnects is that we see God active in the Old Testament a lot. Especially in the first part of the Old Testament, God appears to people. God talks to people. It's almost like God is another person down here, appearing to people, talking to people, doing things. And then as you get over to the book of Exodus, God appears on a mountain with fire and smoke and thunder and lightning and all kinds of noise. And God speaks to people. Remember, Moses goes up to the mountain with God, and he stays there. And that's where he receives the 10 Commandments. And interestingly, as Moses comes down the mountain, he's carrying 2 tablets of stone, in which God himself inscribed the commandments on. Those are the tablets Moses threw down and broke when he saw the people with the golden calf. But God isn't active in the New Testament. We don't ever really see God. A couple of times we hear a voice, but that's all. We see Jesus instead. And that's a significant difference. The figure of God is a major player in the Old Testament, but not in the New. Jesus is the major player of the New Testament. There are many things that are disturbing in the Old Testament. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, when the Hebrews go into the promised land, they are told, of the cities of these people which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them. They are to leave nothing alive, no men, no women, no children, no infants, even the animals. In the book of 1 Samuel, God tells Samuel to go and tell King Saul to attack the Amalekites and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them. Kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. We would call that war crimes today. God sometimes comes across as downright mean in the Old Testament. Listen to this. This really made an impression on me the night we read this. This is from Deuteronomy, what God says he's going to do to the Hebrews if they don't do as he says. The Lord will make the plague cling to you until he has consumed you from the land which you are going to possess. The Lord will strike you with consumption, fever, inflammation, severe burning fever. He will strike you with the sword, with scorching, with mildew. They will pursue you until you perish. The heavens which are over your head shall be bronze, the earth under you shall be iron. The Lord will change the rain of your land to powder and dust. From heaven it will come down upon you until you are destroyed. The Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You shall go out one way against them and flee 7 ways before them. You shall become troublesome to all the kingdoms of the earth. Your carcasses shall be food for all the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and no one shall frighten them away. The Lord will strike you with the boils of Egypt, with tumors, with scabs, with itch, from which you cannot be healed. The Lord will strike you with blindness, madness, and confusion of heart. Now then there is the issue of animal sacrifices, which are commanded in the Old Testament. Now, we can sit here with our Bibles and read about animal sacrifices in our nice houses, they're all clean and all. But when you think about the mechanics of animal sacrifice, this is different. Listen to this from Leviticus. If his offering is a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own free will at the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord. He shall put his hand on the head of the offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. He shall kill the bull before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood all around on the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of meeting. He shall skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire on the altar and put wood in order on the fire. Then the priest shall lay the parts, the head and the fat, in order on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. He shall wash its entrails and its legs with water. And the priest shall burn all on the altar as a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. So they slaughter this thing, and they take the blood, and they sprinkle it all over the altar. Then they rip it apart, they rip out its entrails, and they pile it up here, and they burn it. Now, and that's one thing. If you read on in Leviticus, though, you find that so many sacrifices are required for individuals for this, that, and the other reason. It's not just 1 a month or something. It's like you would have a line of 150 people standing there all the time with an assembly line, and this would be going on constantly. Now you imagine the filth after they sprinkled the blood of 300 or 400 bulls on this thing, and all these carcasses laying around, all these bowels and everything laying around. It would be a gory, sickening thing. It really would be, to imagine. This is not just once a month. This is people lined up every day. The way the requirements are put for when you have to do this, it's a constant thing. Imagine that, just for a minute. But then there's a question, did God really require these sacrifices? If we read on into the Old Testament, we find passages like Isaiah chapter 1 where it says, "To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed cattle. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required this from your hand?" So God's saying, who told you to do this? Then in the book of Hosea, God says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offering." Well, back in Leviticus, God tell him to do it. And now in Isaiah he says, why are you doing this? What's going on? You see how it looks different when you don't just look at one cute little passage at a time and cut out? And there's something else going on. In parts of the Old Testament, God seems to declare that the Hebrews are the only people in the world he cares about. They are his special people, and he really doesn't care about anybody else and is not active among anybody else. And that's what they go on. But yet in the book of Amos, God said, "Are you not like the people of Ethiopia to me, O children of Israel? Did I not bring up Israel from the land of Egypt, the Philistines from Captor, and the Syrians from Kir?" You see, God is saying, who told you you were special? I'm active among all these people. Yeah, I brought you up out of Egypt, but look what I did for these people. Look what I did for these people. Look what I did for these people. I'm active among all the people. And we've talked about this one before. There are a lot of different names for God in the Old Testament, and we have been told that those are just different names for God. Now, nobody knows that's true. They just say that only because they think it has to be that way in order to believe what they want to believe. It's possible, even likely, that those names refer to different deities that the people worshiped over the years. And if you don't believe they worship different deities, the Old Testament flatly tells you they do. They did. Now, of course, we're not the first people in the world that ever noticed this stuff. People noticed it from the very beginning of Christianity. And it caused quite a bit of stir and consternation within Christianity. There was a lot of controversy about it, and the controversy about it lasted for centuries. The question of what to do with this. People dealt with it in various ways. Some Christians took the position that the main deity active in the Old Testament is not the same God we see in the New Testament. Several different ideas developed out of that. We've talked about that before. And to support that, they could point to some very explicit things Jesus had to say to the Jewish leaders. In the Gospel of John, Jesus tells the Pharisees, the top group of Jewish leaders, you know neither me nor my Father. Think about it. You do not know me, you do not know God. He goes on to say, if God were your Father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God. You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He goes on to flatly say, you are not of God. How much plainer can you do? So this idea that the deity active in the Old Testament is not the same as the deity active in the New was a fairly popular way of looking at it within ancient Christianity. It was much more widespread than most people have been led to believe. It is not, though, the view we inherited. Now, there are other issues brought up in some of the things Jesus said. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus said, do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy but to fulfill. For surely I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. And Jesus said that. Just a few verses later, he said, you have heard it said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all. All right, when Jesus said, you have heard it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord, he was quoting explicitly from the law found in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He goes on to say, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, comes straight from Old Testament law found in both Exodus and Leviticus. So up here, Jesus says not one jot or tittle will pass from the law. Down here, he goes on to explicitly cancel out parts of the law. So what do we do with it? We cannot just leave this be, because this affects our credibility as Christians and our witness to the world. And as I thought about this stuff, it soon became clear to me we're missing something. Some piece of the puzzle is missing. Or maybe several pieces of the puzzle are missing. You see, what has happened is that things develop in certain directions, which is what we inherited. And these things were changed from the way it used to be. And since documents and writings and things didn't survive very well in the ancient world, or maybe it was because somebody made sure they wouldn't, we don't know the process of change, and we don't know what things had been before. In other words, there were steps in between there that have been lost to history and we don't know about. There were some steps in there that have been lost to history that we don't know about. Something is missing. That's why a lot of this stuff seems puzzling and doesn't make sense. We don't have all the pieces to the puzzle. The fact is that we know very little about ancient Christianity. Very little, in fact, practically nothing has survived in the historical record about the first 100 or so years, and very, very little has survived about the second 100 years. We just do not know. In the late 1800s and in the 1940s, ancient Christian writings were discovered by accident. It changed our understanding of early Christianity. We found out that certain beliefs that were once thought to have been fringe beliefs were not fringe beliefs at all, but were actually fairly widespread. They were very different from the beliefs we have inherited, and many scholars believe that for a while at least they represented the majority view within Christianity at that time. However, until the 1890s and the mid-1940s, nobody had any idea of this. You know, it makes you wonder what other things lie hidden somewhere that have not yet been discovered, and maybe never will, that would change our entire picture of what Christianity was like in the early years and how people dealt with the issues we're talking about today. It may have been very different than we think. You know, in today's world, with all the documentation we have, everything's on film, everything's on digital video, everything's recorded now. Even with all that, we're still not sure about many things. We're not sure about who killed John Kennedy. And I don't care what anybody says, we're not. We're not sure about the origin of the coronavirus. We're not sure what happened on 9/11. If we can't be sure of things that happened so recently, how in the world do you think we believe we have a complete picture of something that happened 2,000 years ago on the other side of the world? Now think about that for a minute. We don't know where the coronavirus came from, but we know every move they made in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. Now that doesn't mean you won't run into people who will tell you we know what it's like, but they're fooling themselves. They don't know. They do not know. A lot of times we might think it went like this. After Jesus ascended into heaven, there were the disciples there, and then they chose Matthias, so they'd have 12 again. And then there was Pentecost, and then Peter and John went out. Then it was just Peter. Then Paul comes on the scene. And Peter and Paul have a falling out, and Peter goes this way, and Paul goes this way. And we think that everything that developed in Christianity flowed out of that, but that's not the way it was. We know from snippets that have survived in the historical record, from the effects of things that happened, that there were other people active in Christianity also. We know from the Bible that Jesus had many more followers than just those. And we know from the Bible that Jesus appeared to over 500 people after he had risen from the grave. And these disciples, these followers went out. And we know that they did that because we know of versions of Christianity taken to areas that did not come from the disciples in Jerusalem or from Paul. So we don't know what all used to be out there when they never know. That's why I say something's missing. We don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, and my guess is we never will. But even though something is missing, what we have is enough. Traditionally in Christianity, it was never said that Christianity has the answers to all questions. Traditionally, what Christianity said was, it has all things necessary for our salvation. Although you've probably seen the billboards, the Bible has answered all questions. That's not traditionally what Christianity has said. Christianity has said the Bible contains everything we need for our salvation. And sometimes I think people forget that. They want to provide answers to all questions. They want to act like Christianity answers everything. It makes everything perfectly clear. You can connect every dot and come up with this picture. Oh, now I see the complete picture. But that's not the way it is. And it will never be that way this side of heaven. What we see in the Bible does not answer all questions. It provides us all things necessary for our salvation. We cannot make it into more than it itself is. if we try to insist on explaining everything. We have to come up with connections and relations that are simply not there. And when we do that, we become false teachers. We don't intend to do that, but that's what happens. When we make all these connections and try to draw lines everywhere and connect all the dots, we become false teachers. Not intentionally, but we're trying to answer people's questions and make stuff clear, but it won't be clear. It won't ever be clear. So what do we do with the Old Testament? Something that seems to be a misfit. Remember when we looked at the thing from the Old Testament book of Amos, the thing about God being active among all groups of people, not just the Hebrews. There was an early Christian by the name of Justin. He picked up on that. Justin was born in around the year 100. He converted to Christianity as an adult, and some of his written works have survived. He was killed by the Romans for being a Christian in about the year 165, and his works have been valued within Christianity. He is considered one of the seminal thinkers of ancient Christianity. You've probably heard of him. He's called Justin Martyr, since he was martyred and killed for his faith. Now, Justin Martyr was interested in philosophy. That's what he was interested in before he became a Christian. And after he became a Christian and started studying, he believed that all the philosophers of the past, and indeed all the religions, were at least partially inspired by God. And he came to that idea because he believed, he looked at that passage in Amos. He said, okay, God is active in everybody. God is active in all people, everywhere, no matter where they are. God is present and active among all people. And through this, he said, the best of the philosophers and theologians all over the world throughout history were able to produce significant works of theology and philosophy. He believed that God gave them the seminal ideas, but those ideas were just partial, not complete. And for that reason, he believed that all of their ideas could serve as beacons of truth, but just partial beacons of truth. And he believed that their ideas could serve as beacons of truth just as much as the Old Testament did, because God was active in everyone all over the world just as much as he was active in the people of the Old Testament. It's not that God just abandoned the rest of the world and concentrated on 0.00005% of the people of the world and said, to hell with you other people, I just like these people right here. That's not what Justin thought. He believed God was active everywhere. He did believe, though, that all the ideas that came before Jesus, whether from Greek philosophy or from the Old Testament or wherever, were partial. They represent partial beacons of truth. It is only in Jesus that we get the culmination and the completion. It is only in Jesus that we get real truth. Everything we get from other sources is partial. All of the earlier ideas, including those that we get from the Old Testament, are subordinate to and corrected by what we see in Jesus. And this had a tremendous impact on Christian theology. We see it surfacing again in the Protestant Reformation. The two great leaders of the Protestant Reformation, John Calvin and Martin Luther, both said of the Old Testament, we always look at the Old Testament through the eyes of the New. We always start with Jesus, and with the eyes of Jesus, look back. We never stand in the Old Testament and look over here. We always stand in the New Testament and look back.